Welcome to the part 3 of HPC Does Public Issues for the summer of 2019. For those of you who were here last week, which I was not because I was in Montreat with our high school youth, Judge Mitch Perry presented and had a robust discussion. And of course we started with him as a way to kind of get the ball rolling and talk about some of the issues with criminal justice, and it makes perfect sense that we would then follow that up with a presentation from CASA, that is the Court-Appointed Special Advocate Program. We have with us this morning the Executive Director of our local organization, William Myers. Will's has a long history in the nonprofit community. He has served as a Client Services Director at Eastern Area Community Ministries, as well as Executive Director of Louisville Metro Community Action Partnership. He joined CASA here in 2013 as their Executive Director and has grown their program significantly, adding 170 children that they currently serve. And he brings a lot of skills. He holds a BS in sociology from the University of Louisville. He has a law degree from Northern Kentucky University and an MBA from William Howard Taft University. So we are excited to have him here, and I'll invite you to come share your thoughts on CASA and the environment that created CASA and is still making CASA an important part of our community.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. I envision kind of a low-key, informal gathering this morning in terms of speaking about this topic, because it's not one, frankly, that is a very joyful topic. When we talk about child abuse, it's something that, as a society, we really don't like to put a lot of focus on. But it's something that really needs our attention. I don't know if you've seen, but Kentucky is now #1 in the country for child abuse. So when I started at CASA in 2013, there were 23,000 children who were abused and neglected in Kentucky. And if you think about the Kentucky Young Center, it holds about 22,800 people. So that's more than can fit into the Young Center. So it's a huge number of children every year who experience abuse and neglect. And unfortunately, it's continued to progress. So that was in 2013 when it was about 23,000, and we're now up to 33,000. So we've grown by 10,000 children within the last 6 years who have experienced child abuse. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. So Kentucky is #1, and unfortunately Indiana is #2 for child abuse. So we're in the heart of this epidemic. And when I was asked to come this morning and present on the topic, there was a real interest in the reasons and causes as to why we had this epidemic of child abuse. So kind of what our understanding has been is that a lot of it is due to substance abuse. So previously in Kentucky, as you know, and you might have heard from a speaker in this very series, which I'm very glad that you do. I've heard a lot about Highland and your commitment to social justice, your commitment to the community, and I'm really glad to be here and be able to present on this topic to you. And as a community, we had a problem with opioids. They were coming into Kentucky at a very, very fast rate. You may have seen the newspaper that in some places, millions and millions of pills were going to towns with, very, very tiny populations. So one of the ways that this was combated in Kentucky is that the law was changed to prevent opioids from being as easily accessible. This was done by Attorney General Jack Conway several years ago, who was a predecessor to Andy Beshear. And when this happened, it was with the intention of getting rid of opioids, but what it did was it made them so hard to procure that people chose another substance. So we started to see the influx of heroin into Kentucky. And we started to see the influx of other drugs as well. And so that kind of compounded and grew to the point where we are now, where Judge Denise Brown, who's one of our family court judges, said that she estimates about 95% of our child abuse cases have some kind of substance-related issue, either drugs or alcohol or things like that. So that's kind of how we got to this landscape, that there was the first fold issue of drugs and addiction, which permeates all areas of our family court system. My colleague, Sherry Christoph, who's been with CASA for 25 years, said that this is an idea of how much it's changed. When she started 25 years ago, I'm really bad at math, that's why I went to law school, because I can't count, but 25 years ago from this, she said she mainly saw dirty house cases, things that you'd see like on the show Hoarders. It would be dirty house cases, kids not going to school, what we would call truancy previously. And that's really morphed because of the drug epidemic to where now it's parents not taking care of children because of the addiction. We're seeing one of the kind of situations that we saw recently. It made the news. It wasn't one of our cases, but it was a 4-year-old who was walking on the side of St. Andrew's Church Road because the parents were passed out and the child had gotten out of the home and was walking on this busy street. So there's a real lack of oversight by parents who are addicted. So that's issue number one. The second issue that we've dealt with, in addition to the drug abuse, has been the issues related to the recession. So as you know, as a social justice focused congregation, we had the recession in 2007 and 8, and it's kind of continued on. And unfortunately, there was not the rebound of opportunity that we saw before the recession in terms of jobs, in terms of financial growth. And so we did see an uptick in abuse and neglect during the time of the recession, because anytime you have stressors on families, you're going to have stressors on children. There's going to be an increase in abuse and neglect. There's going to be a decrease in oversight and watching of children. There are going to be lots of things that go on in the family that impact those things. So I'd say that these two things are kind of main contributors to how we got to where we are. So we're in this situation now where we have a huge number of children who are abused and neglected, 33,000, the most in the country. And we also have the problem of children that are going into foster care. So in Kentucky and nationally, the preference is to place children with family members, because despite the outside understanding of families that go through this kind of trauma and trying to understand why children would want to be in those situations, why it's encouraged, the studies do show that children placed back with a parent once they're stable is the best thing for the child. And I think that the best visual for this, does anybody watch This Is Us? You do? So there's, just as a background, it's a story, it's a TV show that talks about the life of a family and several families. And I had to actually, I'll confess, stop watching it because it got so real, given the work that we do, that I kind of needed to take a break from it. But they have the story of a child in foster care there. And she goes from foster home to foster home, which is often the case. Some of our kids can go into foster home, up to 12 different foster homes. And that they showed how, the average person would say, why aren't you happy in this foster home? Why aren't you settled in this foster home? And she really just wanted to get back to her mother. Because even though her mother, it was unstable, she was dealing with addiction, she knew what to expect. She knew kind of, if you, I guess the analogy would be that if you daily have a routine where something goes on, even if it's bad, you still know what to expect, and there's a fear of change, naturally so. I guess that there would be kind of an allegory to going to a job you don't like. Thankfully, I like my job, so this is not mine. But there's a fear in kind of reaching out because you know what to expect. And that's the same thing that goes on in foster care. So with this epidemic of 33,000 children in care, there are not enough foster homes. And we've seen that steadily rise. So in 2013, there were about 6,000 kids in foster homes. There are now 10,000 children in foster homes. So it's gone up very, very significantly. And only 1 in 4 children in Jefferson County is in Jefferson County. So children are being sent to Somerset, they're being sent to Paducah because there are just not enough foster homes for the kids. And there's a national movement to get kids out of group homes like St. Joe's, like Maryhurst and other places because they want to get them stable enough and the family stable enough to go back home. So with that landscape, there then are the problems that come along with foster care. And that is that when you have that many children in foster care, the first is, as I discussed, not enough placements. And then the second is that the state's not reimbursing families for foster care that are not foster homes. So some children go into non-relative placement, non-relative foster homes. So those are going to be families that, out of the goodness of their hearts, have taken children into their homes and want to help them get stable. The other case are going to be family foster homes, family foster care. And those are going to be families that take on a family member, either a nephew or somebody like that, into the home either until stabilization or until adoption. Kentucky did not pay those families for this service previously. So then you have the issue of, you have people that are already, in a lot of times, generationally impacted by abuse and neglect. There may be issues of generational poverty. And then you ask them to raise another child when they sometimes can barely care for their own children because of generational poverty and challenges that we have on them as a society. And so there was a lawsuit filed against the governor, and it actually went through, and the result was that families with kinship care is the name for it. They had to be paid for those services. Unfortunately, that's been very slow going. The payments to families have not been actualized, or they've been actualized very, very slowly. So that obviously adds a stressor, because if you have families in these situations, you don't have a lot of resources to care for the kids, and you're not having extra money come in. So that's the second. Addiction, you have kids in foster care and stressors. And then the third is that our system is not equipped to care for this many children. So social services has had a very, I would say, growing influence on the lives of our kids for the better. So you think back to maybe the 50s and 60s, and there wasn't the robust social services system that we have now. The prevailing perception was in some places, this is not my business, this is another family's business, and people started to get involved in the lives of children, which was a good thing, because we're seeing now where that's happening. But the system hasn't kept up. And so now we're seeing social workers in Kentucky, and in Kentucky, every child must be appointed a social worker and a guardian ad litem who's an attorney. We're seeing kids appointed to these social workers, but social workers can have up to 30 to 50 kids. So because of that, I think of teachers, and some of you may have been teachers in here. God bless you if you were, because that's the hardest job that I think I can think of. And you think of a class with 30 kids and trying to keep the kids together and know all their needs and teach them specifically, it's really, really hard to do. Now add to that grandparents, birth parents, foster parents, and being a social worker is an extremely hard job. And we don't have the resources to provide for them. We don't have enough social workers. We don't have enough people who want to be social workers. It's a very difficult and demanding job. They're threatened. They go into very dangerous places. And so all of these things kind of compound to make our system more and more complex. And that's where CASA gets in. So I know that my colleague came and spoke to the church previously about what we do, but I'll give a little more in-depth discussion of kind of how we became involved in Kentucky. So in 1976, Judge David Soucoup in Seattle, Washington realized that the system was getting overburdened. And he had the foresight to say, there really needs to be an extra set of eyes and ears for the kids that are abused and neglected. So he trained court watchers and court-involved volunteers to get involved with the system and start to talk about how they can help and how they can make a difference. And the movement spread rapidly. It spread to different areas and came to Kentucky in 1984. We were the first program. Our program is CASA of the River Region. So it grew in 1984 through the efforts of the National Council of Jewish Women, through the efforts of the Jefferson County District Court judges, as well as JCPS. They all realized that these kids needed somebody else to be their advocate and their mentor. So we slowly grew, and we've tried to address the issues of being present for kids. The movement now has 21 CASA programs in Kentucky. We are the largest in Jefferson County. We encompass Jefferson, Henry, Oldham, Trimble, Shelby, and Spencer counties. So everywhere in the periphery except Bullitt County belongs to our CASA. And we train volunteers. People express an interest. They want to become volunteers. And they have to go through a mandatory 30-hour training. And then we assign them with a staff member. There must be one staff member to every 30 volunteers. That's all in the Kentucky Revised Statutes, so they regulate how we operate. We're not a government agency, but we do get regulated by the government. And we train volunteers who then advocate for the kids. So they go to court with the kids, they mentor the kids, they get to know them, they go to school with them, they really are there to spend, there's no watch. They really are there to spend time with them, to get to know what their needs are, and to give that as a report to the judge. And we've seen a lot of successes. We've had about 15,000 children served by our CASA program so far in the roughly 34, 35 years that we've been in existence. So we've made a lot of impact there. We work with the social workers and the guardian ad litems to act in the best interests of the kids. And then we're appointed by the judge to do that. And some of the success stories are things that, they may seem mundane, but they really, really have a huge impact on the life of the kids we serve. So, for example, we had a child who was going to go into foster care in the system and had no one to care for her. And the CASA volunteer was able to find an aunt who didn't realize she was going into foster care, asked for custody, was awarded custody, and eventually adopted the child. The child moved to Texas and became a nurse, and avoided the entire system because the CASA reached out and found the aunt. Similarly, we had a case of a child who was transported to Somerset, because again, there are no foster homes in our area left, and he ended up going to an institution in Somerset, and the CASA volunteer arrived to visit him at Thanksgiving, and they had separated the kids into kids who would have people visit and kids who wouldn't for Thanksgiving. And unfortunately, the kids who wouldn't have somebody visit was much more sizable than the kids who would have somebody to visit. And this volunteer went there, had Thanksgiving with the kid, and was the only one who showed up for the kid that he served. Similarly, we've had kids that have gone to the hospital because of issues related to health care, and the CASA's gone to sit with the volunteer, the CASA's gone to sit with the child in the hospital when they had nobody else to do it. So it's practical presence. It is church lingo would be maybe a Stephen minister, or maybe a person that reaches out and is present. It's the same thing that what a CASA does. It's a lay person in the community who is well-intentioned, who has the ability to understand what the child needs, has the ability to think critically, and just advocates for the child. We've been doing it now, as I said, for about 35 years. We've had tremendous successes, as I've mentioned, but there is a long way to go. There are issues related to the system and how it works. Because social workers are overwhelmed, when we do surveys of what it means to be a CASA, they get frustrated naturally because they don't get called back, they don't get access to resources, because it's really, really challenging to do this type of work. But it is extremely, extremely rewarding. We had another case of a CASA volunteer who was going, she had been the CASA volunteer for the child when she was a baby. The child grew up, had her own baby, and called her to ask her how to parent the child, her own child, because she'd not been parented well herself or didn't know how to parent. So it's generational contact sometimes, not always. It scares people when I say that CASAs are going to be involved for decades. That is not the case. People get to choose if they want to be involved for decades. But it is a tangible way that people can make a difference in how things work. There are bright spots on the horizon. Every time I come to do these lectures and these talks, my family's like, please cheer things up a little bit. Because it's in fact, at my own Thanksgiving, my family says, please stop talking about child abuse, because it is an important part of my life, something about which I care greatly, and it's also a very depressing topic. So, bright spots. There are people who are willing to do this work. There are people that want to be involved. We have one in our group here, one that she's a wonderful volunteer who wants to volunteer, wants to give back. Lynn March of your congregation is also a CASA volunteer who wants to give back, who wants to be involved. So there are people that want to make a difference, and they are doing it, even in this congregation. There is hope on the horizon in terms of assistance with foster care, with getting the kinship care dollars in. We're hopeful that that's going to happen. There are increasing numbers of people who are opening up their homes to foster care, who are growing and trying to be responsive into how they respond to the crisis. And that's probably the most giving and generous way that people can be involved in what we do is a foster home, because that's a 24/7 commitment. We ask that CASA volunteers give about 2 to 5 hours a week, and that is a very generous way to ensure that children have access to what they need. There are growing movements to track how kids are served. So there are things, the Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, are ways that we can track how kids have trauma and respond to them with trauma-informed care. There are more and more social workers who are being trained in these methods to respond to kids who need it. There are more and more individuals locally who are being trained in ways to respond. So these are practical ways that you as a community can get involved. You can get involved through becoming a CASA volunteer. You can be involved by donating to CASA. I would not be doing my job if I didn't ask for money. That's what I do. You can donate to CASA in addition to donating to your church, so we don't want to poach anybody's income. There are also ways that you can get involved by telling people about CASA, about what we do. And then as a church community, there are other things you can do to be trained in how to effectively respond to people who are in these situations. So, as I mentioned, learning about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences. There is now a service being provided called Mental Health First Aid. And it's a way that you can learn basically first aid for people who have mental illness or people who are struggling with mental health issues. And many of our kids are. There's a dramatic number who are dealing with issues related to their trauma, substance abuse, PTSD, dealing with lots of different ways and impacts. You can become involved in the various committees and movements that are being done around child abuse. So there's the Face It initiative to end child abuse. It's being spearheaded by COSAIR Charities. There is the Bounce Coalition that works with kids in early childhood education. There is the SHIELD. It's a collective impact initiative for people that have been impacted by trauma and abuse. Because all of these things really go hand in hand. We work very closely with Home of the Innocents, with Family and Children's Place, with the Center for Women and Families. We all work together to serve what is essentially the same population, because that's who we work with and that's who we're trying to empower to get out of this situation. So that's kind of a very overarching view of what we do, what the state of child abuse is in Kentucky, and how we impact it. And I wanted to leave ample time for questions, because I've spoken to several churches before, and I've not left time for questions. And they said at the end, we would really like to ask questions, but you didn't shut up long enough for us to ask you questions. So I've gone on a little bit, but what questions do you have? Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I have a whole handful, but my first one is,
I'll take them.
how confident are you of your numbers? Don't the numbers reflect only children who have been identified and taken into the system? And given the problems with social workers, is there any reason to think that this is not just the tip of an iceberg?
So that is a fantastic question. Yes. The overarching, I have to think about how to respond to that. So there are, as I mentioned, the 30,000 plus number are the number of children who've had phone calls. So somebody's called the child abuse hotline and said, Johnny is being abused. There are a lot of kids who don't get those calls. The first line of defense are teachers. Teachers often make the calls because people don't want to get involved. Neighbors don't want to get involved, it's messy, family members don't want to get involved. So there are a lot of times the first line of defense. But there are a lot of people who don't make the calls, and we really need them to make those calls to give us an idea of what the landscape is. When the calls come in and they're investigated, they go on to an investigation team. This statistic is from last Friday. Because there are not enough resources and social workers on the desk at the L&N building right now, there are 5,000 files that have been called in as abuse and neglect cases, but not investigated. 5,000 children are part of that 33,000 number that have had no investigations whatsoever.
They probably have siblings.
They do. So this is an example of why that is so scary. We had a case of a child who's being sexually molested by her father. And the report was called in. It was not investigated for 6 months. So 6 more months of sexual abuse by her own father. And that is why we've got to put more resources towards this, because, so of the 33,000 cases, 26,000 make it to court. So you have more children that are abused that don't get calls. You get, of that, children who are not investigated, and then some of them don't make it to court. So they may do a diversion, they may do a type of mediation, they may try to do something to keep it out of court. And so the system is a lot worse than I even alluded to, unfortunately. So, yes, ma'am.
So out of all of these children that are in the system, how are those selected to get a CASA?
Great question. So we have to be appointed by the judge, and ultimately the judge makes the decision. So over the life of the cases that we've had, the average age has been about 6 to 9. When I started, it was 6, and we've asked the judges to increase the number of appointments to older children, because we know that they really don't have a lot of time, somebody to advocate for them. Typically, we just did a longitudinal, long-term study on why judges appoint to us, and they typically don't appoint us to infants. We get that, but there's a lot of focus on infants because of obviously an infant has no ability to care for themselves. And the same thing with teenagers. They have an ability to speak out. They have an ability to be more vocal. I'm an adoptive parent, and my kids are 7 and 4, and they're about the same ages of CASA kids, because when they get to be teenagers, they can tell me how unhappy they are with me. And I'm sure they will tell me over and over, those of you who have children. So at that point, we're at the age now, about 6 to 9, where the kids really need an advocate. And the judge will say, looking at this case, I think there needs to be an extra set of eyes and ears. Judge Richard Fitzgerald and then Judge Jerry Bowles, both retired, and unfortunately Judge Fitzgerald has passed on, said that while social workers and attorneys provide the primary colors, CASAs provide the pastels. So we provide a bigger landscape of understanding of the children's needs. And so the judges have told us that that's typically when CASAs get involved, is they say, I really need an extra set of eyes and ears on this case. Maybe the parents were in the systems themselves, and so they're afraid of generational abuse and neglect. Maybe they feel like that, the kids are in a tenuous circumstance. So it's ultimately up to the judges. I wish I had a more academic answer, but it's kind of up to them. And we do have, Kentucky is unique in that we have family court judges. Not every county has family court judges, but Jefferson has 10 family court judges. And children are assigned to each judge based on the last name of the birth mother. So the mother's last name, they get assigned to a different judge. And then in our service area, we have 2 more, one in Shelby Spencer and one in Henry Oldham and Trimble. So we have 12 judges, each who appoint in different ways, each who have different interest levels in terms of how they appoint. And so it can kind of vary, but generally it's within that 6 to 9 age range and needing an extra set of eyes. Yeah.
Can I add something?
Please do.
Then once CASA gets their cases, I'm a CASA, so then I go to see my supervisor, and then we pick which case we want. So I'm on my 2nd case, and I then see the profiles of the cases that my supervisor has that are available, and then I choose the case that I want to work with.
That's right. And we're unique in that way because a lot of CASA programs, they assign the case, but what we found is if there's a person who, so 65% of our volunteers are full-time employed, but somebody who has a full-time job and a family oftentimes can't take a case with 8 children. And so we allow people to pick because we found that it really helps with retention. We have an 83% retention rate, which I'm extremely proud because the national average is 50%. So we're retaining volunteers, and I think part of that has to do with their ability to pick. So that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a two-part question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you mentioned ACEs. I was wondering, is there a statistic of personality disorders developed by children affiliated with ACEs? And also, are there programs for young adults to adjust to society after coming out of this program?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So ACEs, we're at the cusp of being able to understand ACEs and be able to administer the test of ACEs. So ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, it's a questionnaire basically, and has a number of questions. Have you ever been exposed to drug use? Do you have an intact home of 2 parents? What are the things that are going on in your life? And then they assign a score based on these questions. And it gives an indication of the trauma level of each child. We know statistically that children with abuse and neglect have a much higher ACEs score than children without. And that is really important because we also know statistically that children who've been abused and neglected, their brains have more trauma than even soldiers in war. So the brain is rewired to be very different because of trauma. And so what we try to do is administer the ACEs test, and we're getting ready to do this to understand where they fall to provide some level of baseline of how to appropriately work with the kids. They do get, in terms of personality disorders, they do get access to a lot of services. Centerstone and other places will work with them. The vast majority of our kids are involved in some kind of therapy or counseling. They may have dual diagnoses because they are involved and because of their history. We don't administer as ourselves any kind of professional assessments related to mental health, but we do make sure they get those services. So that's another great example of CASA's impact. We had a child that was in the system for about 8 months, had not had access to therapy or therapeutic services, and we were able to facilitate that by really getting the ball rolling and calling to make sure they had access to it. So while we don't diagnose, while we don't do the professional part as lay people, we do get access to those services. And then in regards to children that are getting out of the system, we do have access to services, thankfully, in Kentucky, but they're not always well utilized. So in Kentucky, children have the ability to recommit to the system. And when they recommit to the system, they get their college paid for. So they have free college at a state university. Unfortunately, that is very low as a statistic. I believe the last time I checked, only 6% of those kids recommit, and only 2% of the kids who recommit graduate from college. So it's a very low statistic. And you can, I mean, any teenager, again, when my children become teenagers, I anticipate that they won't want me to administer everything that they do. Again, those parents in here can probably reaffirm that. Maybe some of you didn't have that, hopefully. But you're working with kids who've had social workers basically telling them what to do, for lack of a better phrase, their entire life. So they don't want to recommit. They want to get out and live their lives. They don't want to be foster kids. And so because of that, unfortunately, they don't take advantage of the system, and they don't have the resources that a lot of us had. I had parents thankfully, who showed me this is how you apply, this is how you do things. They may not have known the nuances of FAFSAs and all the other things, but they were able to encourage my college attendance. Our kids don't have that. But there are systems like that in place with, there's free college, there is there are local organizations, True Up is one that people can get involved in, especially young people, to do life skills classes for kids. We also offer life skills classes to our kids to help them with job readiness, to help them with understanding how to be in healthy relationships, and to help them with money management skills. So in terms of how services that can be provided, you could volunteer with us if you didn't want to be a CASA on teaching those classes. You could get involved with True Up, who offers those classes. There are independent living coordinators from the state who work with kids who've gotten out of foster care. So there are, thankfully, a plethora of services if kids want to take advantage of them. Go ahead, and then, yeah.
Okay, how well served are children who are Black or Hispanic or whose families don't speak English?
So in terms of the data that I've seen, interestingly, the data, we did not think that children of color would be served as well with CASAs. Fortunately for our organization, the children that we serve match the statistics of the census in terms of African American children. That is not true with Asian and Latino children. Our understanding is that those cultures have more support systems that prevent the children from going into care. So children from Latino cultures as well as Asian cultures seem to have a higher community support system. Those are CASA statistics. Overall, there are a disproportionate number of children in care who are children of color. The last statistic I saw, I believe it was in the 40% of children who are African American, while our census indicates that about 20, anywhere from, depending on what county or where you live, 12 to 20% are. So there is a higher number. So that's something that we have to address in the community.
What color are CASA volunteers?
CASA volunteers are overwhelmingly white women. They are white women in their 50s and 60s. I'm not making a comment about your age. But they're overwhelmingly white women in their 50s and 60s. We are trying to recruit people of color. We've not been very successful at that. We're really trying to recruit men. We have at any time 7 to 10 men out of 211 volunteers. So 211 volunteers, 7 to 11 of which are men, roughly about 7 to 15 of which are African American. And we have 2 volunteers who speak Spanish. That's it. So we really need diversity. Yes, ma'am.
What does a typical CASA volunteer's week look like? You said 2 to 5 hours. What
Sure.
What are they doing during those 2 to 5 hours?
Sure. You're the expert. You mind to speak to this?
Sure. I'm kind of OCD, so sometimes maybe I do a little bit more than I should.
Right.
But we are expected to, asked to visit our children at least once a week. I have this particular case that I'm on, both of my cases, I'm on my second case, both of my cases have involved substance abuse issues. Both of my cases have involved 3 children, but they both have had 2 different fathers. So in this particular case that I'm in currently, my children are divided. In this case, 2 of the children are with their natural father, and one of the other child is with a natural father. So I have 2 homes that I'm visiting the children at. So my supervisor has said, you know, if you visit one set this week and the other set that week, that's fine. It varies. Sometimes I visit all 3 in one week. But anyway, you are supposed to have eyes-on contact with the children at least once a week. So that's usually an hour visit plus travel time. I vary that. I try to visit them in the schools where they are. I try to visit them in daycare. So your week involves in visiting the children. It involves emails. One of my little girls, it was pretty clear early on that she has had some trauma involved with what she had witnessed in the home, and I felt like she wasn't getting counseling that she needed. So very quickly I tried to establish a relationship with the CPS worker to try to get her on my side, because I do realize how busy she is. And so I started including her very quickly in my emails to my supervisor so that she could buy in that I was serious and legit. So pretty quickly she saw that I was in the home. They are only expected to visit there each case once a month, or I'm in the home once a week. So she could see pretty quickly that I was able to see things a lot more thoroughly than she was, and she started buying into making me her teammate. So I was able to get the child into counseling. So that was one of the successes I did. So there was there's emails, there are phone conferences with my supervisor. Does that answer your question?
Well, like the one that found the aunt, did you do research, or did that person do research? We'll try to track down a family member,
They
the
did.
aunt that they
They did.
found,
The
that
one
kind of
Chris brought up,
thing.
man.
Okay,
You go
in-
research court
And
records.
in this case, the little girl that's by herself with her father, we're having problems with the birth mother is the one that does not have her children right now. But she is allowed visitations with her children, but they have to be supervised. We are having a hard time finding someone to supervise visitations for this mother currently. She doesn't really want to have supervised visitations set up in a center, because with the other two children that she has, she's getting a lot of visitations with the natural father. They've got a good relationship, so she's seeing them multiple times a week. With this other father, there's not a good relationship, so she just can't go to that home and visit. So we are currently trying to seek out family members that can supervise that visit. So I have discovered through lots of questions, a brother, a mother, a father, so then I've got that information to the CPS worker to do background checks. So we are dating, so there is footwork involved.
When you're assigned, you go to court.
Yes, I am in court every time that there is a trial, and court can be every 2 to 3 months, depending upon when it comes up. And potentially you have to testify. And one thing that I have found is that the judges are extremely supportive and very respectful of the CASAs. My first case was with Denise Brown. My judge now is Judge Webb. And they always look at CASA, ask us to give our report, and are very, very respected and want to hear what we have to say.
It's great.
And that's a good overview. We do ask people to visit the kids every 2 weeks. So at least every 2 weeks, we ask them to speak to the kids every week, either by phone or kind of some kind of contact. And yeah, it's researching the family, it's researching who's involved, it's getting to talk to the social workers, a lot of emails. It's just making sure that somebody's there for the kids. A lot of times I get questions about safety. We do ask people to go to the children's home to see the conditions that they're living in. But a lot of times our volunteers will meet the children, as was discussed, at school. They may meet them in the library. They may meet them in different places. If they're not comfortable going into the home or they want to have a public place. Sometimes that's a concern of men, that they do not want to be alone with the child, understandably. And so we try to have mechanisms for that to be able to allow everybody to volunteer.
I have one question. As you look into the future with this very complex role you're existing in and trying to make difference, what gives you the most support? What's your biggest concern?
child abuse is probably the backlog of cases. The 5,000 number is massive, and we don't know what's happening to those 5,000 children. They're not being investigated by a social worker. They're not being watched by anybody else. So the biggest fear that I have are the children that fall through the cracks, that don't get reported, that are stuck on a desk somewhere, the children that we can't serve. So we had 211 volunteers last year. They served 627 kids. There were 3,800 kids that needed service. So we served 628 out of 3,800. Now, not all of those children needs a CASA. Some of them are just in the system because of, their parents miss school too many times. Or the parents were late too many times, things like that. But we estimate about 1,500 are in dire need of a CASA. But we don't have anybody to assign to them. We do not have enough. And so I worry about those cases. I worry about the kids that aren't being served. I worry about the kids that are on a desk somewhere. I worry about the kids to which we are assigned. We don't have anybody to give the kids, to advocate for them. Those are the things that really make me nervous. Because we know, I love statistics, although I can't count because I'm not good at math. I do like statistics nonetheless. And we know the outcomes. So children with a CASA, they spend 8 months less in care, 8 months less in foster care. It saves the state $1.5 million to keep those kids out of care for 8 months less. That's our program alone. Multiply that by the 20 other programs, and it's a huge savings to the state. We did a study of kids before CASAs and after CASAs. They missed 32 days of school less once they had a CASA. That's a month of school less that they missed once they had a CASA volunteer. 49%. Their grades, they jumped from, we did a study with JCPS of the children before CASA and after CASA. The children that were considered failing, 47% of the children that were considered failing, that number went to 75% passing after a CASA got involved. It's huge, huge impact. And we want more people to do it, but it's scary. And so that's my biggest fear, is not having enough resources. So, yeah. Any other questions? I think worship's at 11, so you've got a long time. I'm here for questions if you want.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I am pleased to be part of a congregation that has volunteers in this organization. And thank you, Will. Adult Ed, when we conceived this kind of reboot of the issues class for the summer, we made a special effort to try to think through the kind of topics that were kind of interrelated. We see this, we are talking about isolated sessions with specific leadership, with the ability to answer the kind of questions that those sessions call for. But we see this as kind of an ongoing process for the summer. We looked at the way all of these topics kind of are integrated. So I want to remind you that coming up in June, next week we are going to be talking about homelessness in Louisville. The discussion and presentation is going to be led by Natalie Harris. She's the executive director of the Homeless Coalition, and I asked her if she could possibly twist the arm of Bill Hollander, our Louisville Metro Councilman, who took a stand to try to help everyone who was looking at the homeless crisis of the previous year with the issues of the folks who were under the highway and with all the public outdoor. He really pushed for a compassionate solution and tried to be a leader in that regard. So that is next week, June the 23rd, and then on June the 30th, really the continuation of this discussion is we're going to talk about the opioid crisis. And we're fortunate to have in our congregation Dr. Martin Hall as one of our elders. He is on faculty at the Kent School, and this issue of opioid crisis and substance abuse is his area of research expertise. So if you've heard him speak here before, he's done it at least one of the times I know of. He will bring a lot of insight. And then in our first week in July, we're going to talk about mental health issues, led by Claude Dryad. So the rest of the summer, July, we have affordable housing. Kathy Hinko here, she's executive director of the MAC. On July the 14th, Evolve 502, a tuition scholarship program. We're going to have Mary Gwynn Wheeler and Marlon Cole from Evolve 502. And on our final class of this summer, July 28th, will be the Barbara Young, the provost of Simmons College. So protect your calendars. Thank you. Go in peace.